For most of human history, being human did not mean being alone. There was a time when our planet had several kinds of humans walking around at the same time. Some were tall, some were short, some were built like tanks for freezing climates. Others lived on tiny islands and became so small they could barely reach your waist. And here's the part that should mess with your head. We weren't supposed to be the last ones. Homo sapiens was just one branch on a huge human family tree. We weren't the oldest. We weren't obviously the strongest. And we weren't even the only humans smart enough to survive. Yet somehow, everyone else disappeared. Today, if you walk outside, every person you see belongs to the same human species, Homo sapiens. That's normal to us. But it wasn't normal for almost all of human history. So what happened to everybody else? The answer isn't one giant war. It isn't one mysterious disaster. And it probably wasn't because we were simply better. The real story is much stranger. Because some of these humans survived for hundreds of thousands of years. One survived for almost 2 million. And one disappeared so recently that it may have shared the planet with our own ancestors. So let's start with the human species that makes our entire history look ridiculously short. Homo erectus. Homo erectus appeared roughly 2 million years ago. Just stop and think about that number. Modern human civilization has existed for only a tiny fraction of that time. Your entire life is basically nothing compared with the amount of time Homo erectus spent on Earth. They weren't some weird half-human creature stumbling around. They had long legs, shorter arms, and bodies built for walking long distances. Their bodies were already surprisingly human-looking. And they did something huge. They were among the first humans to spread far beyond Africa. That meant they had to enter places their ancestors had never lived before. New climates, new animals, new landscapes. They had stone tools, controlled fire, and found ways to survive in environments that could be brutal. Their brains were smaller than ours, but they didn't need modern technology to survive. They had something we sometimes forget about humans. They were extremely good at making do with what they had. And they didn't just survive for a few thousand years. They survived for nearly 2 million. That's longer than we can even mentally picture. But eventually, their story started to fall apart. Some of the last populations of Homo erectus appear to have survived on the Indonesian island of Java. And being on an island can be a blessing. Until the environment changes. If food becomes harder to find, you can't simply walk hundreds of miles into a new territory. If your population gets too small, finding mates becomes harder. If the climate changes, the animals you depend on can disappear. Suddenly, a species that survived almost everything for millions of years has fewer and fewer options. And that's one of the first lessons in this story. Survival isn't just about being strong. Sometimes it's about having enough people, enough food, and enough room to adapt when things change. Homo erectus eventually disappeared. A human species that had survived for almost 2 million years was gone. But here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Because while Homo erectus was disappearing, another human species was thriving in Europe and parts of Asia. The Neanderthals. And if you've ever pictured a Neanderthal as a dumb caveman dragging a club around, forget that image. It's wrong. Neanderthals were seriously tough. Their bodies were compact, powerful, and built for cold environments. They had strong bones, broad bodies, and huge muscles. They hunted large animals at close range. And that was not exactly a safe job. Imagine getting close enough to a massive animal with nothing like a modern rifle. One mistake could mean the end. Their skeletons actually show how physically rough their lives could be. But Neanderthals weren't just strong. They controlled fire. They made tools. They cared for injured members of their groups. They likely buried some of their dead. And their brains were, on average, at least as large as ours and sometimes larger. So here's the question. If Neanderthals were so capable, why aren't they still here? Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began spreading into regions where Neanderthals already lived. And for a while, the two human species existed at the same time. They weren't separated by millions of years. They were neighbors. And here's something that makes the story even crazier. They had children together. Modern people outside Africa still carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA. So Neanderthals didn't completely disappear without a trace. A part of them is still inside some of us. But as populations changed, Neanderthals became more isolated. Their numbers were probably already low in many areas. Climate kept shifting. Animals moved. Food supplies changed. And now they had another human species competing for some of the same land and resources. Homo sapiens may have had an important advantage here. Not necessarily bigger muscles. Not necessarily bigger brains. Connections. Humans could form larger social networks. A group could lose access to food, but information could travel from another group. A useful tool design could spread. A hunting trick could spread. A new way of surviving a cold period could spread. And that changes everything. Because imagine two groups facing the exact same disaster. One group has only the knowledge inside its own small community. The other has connections to dozens of communities. If one group loses its knowledge, it's gone. If the other loses a few people, the knowledge may already exist somewhere else. That difference doesn't look powerful at first, but over thousands of years, it can become enormous. Eventually, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. And once again, a human species that had survived for hundreds of thousands of years was gone. But they weren't the only humans sharing the planet with us. There was another group that is almost like a ghost. The Denisovans. And this is where the human story gets really weird. Scientists didn't discover the Denisovans because they found an entire skeleton. They started with a tiny piece of bone found in a cave in Siberia. A finger bone. That's it. At first, it didn't look like much. But when scientists tested its DNA, something strange happened. It didn't match modern humans. It didn't match Neanderthals. It belonged to a previously unknown human population. Think about how crazy that is. A whole human population existed for thousands of years. And we almost completely missed them. We barely have their bones. But their DNA tells us they were real. And their genetic legacy is still alive today. Some populations in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan ancestry. And one Denisovan-related gene helps modern people living at extremely high altitudes deal with low oxygen. So a human group we can barely see in the fossil record is still influencing how some people live today. That's one of the strangest things about human evolution. Sometimes a species can disappear without completely disappearing. Their bodies are gone. Their communities are gone. Their language is gone. But pieces of them can remain inside people living thousands of years later. And then we get to one of the strangest humans ever discovered. Homo floresiensis. They lived on the Indonesian island of Flores. And they were tiny. Adults were around 1 meter tall. That's roughly the height of a young child today. Their brains were also much smaller than ours. But don't make the mistake of thinking that means they were helpless. They made stone tools. They survived on an island filled with animals that could be dangerous. They lived alongside creatures such as giant storks, Komodo dragons, and dwarf elephants. And their small size may actually have been part of what helped them survive there. When a population gets trapped on an island for a very long time, evolution can take some unexpected turns. Large animals can become smaller because food is limited. And that's potentially what happened here. Homo floresiensis became an extreme example of how different a human species could become. For a long time, scientists weren't even sure what they were looking at. Was this a strange modern human? A disease? A developmental condition? Or an entirely different species? More evidence eventually pointed towards something much more interesting. Another kind of human. And here's the part that really gets you. Their disappearance happened relatively recently. Some evidence suggests they survived until roughly 50,000 years ago, although exactly when they disappeared is still debated. That means our own species may have been entering the same part of the world around the time these tiny humans were still there. Just imagine that for a second. You could have had one kind of human walking through a forest, while another kind was living somewhere nearby. Different body, different history, different way of seeing the world. And today, they're gone. So now we have a problem. If Neanderthals were strong, if Denisovans were adapted to extreme environments, if Homo erectus survived for almost 2 million years, and if Homo floresiensis could survive on an isolated island, why are we the only ones left? The easy answer is intelligence. But that doesn't really work. Because intelligence isn't enough. Being strong isn't enough. Being adaptable isn't enough. Surviving for a long time isn't enough. The answer may have been something much less obvious. We connected. Humans didn't just build families. We built networks. We exchanged information. We copied ideas. We learned from people we had never met. And eventually, knowledge became something bigger than any single person. That's incredibly important because your biggest advantage isn't always what you personally know. It's what your group knows. Think about your own life. You don't know how to build your phone from scratch. You probably couldn't make a computer processor. You couldn't grow every ingredient in your food. You don't know how to produce electricity, build a plane, make medicine, or manufacture the thousands of things you use every day. But you don't need to, because you live inside a giant network of shared knowledge. Someone else knows how, and someone taught them, and someone taught that person. That's the same basic idea that may have helped our species survive. One human didn't need to know everything. Humanity just needed to keep passing knowledge forward. And that may be one of the biggest reasons we're still here. But there's another uncomfortable truth. Luck mattered. Geography mattered. Climate mattered. Population size mattered. Being in the right place at the right time mattered. Homo sapiens wasn't guaranteed to win. There was no rule saying we had to become the last human species. For most of our existence, we were just another group trying not to die. We could have disappeared too, if a few major climate events had gone differently, if populations had collapsed, if certain migrations never happened, if our ancestors had failed to adapt. You and I might be living in a world where another human species was telling this story about us. And that's what makes this history personal. Because when you look at the people around you, you're not looking at the result of some perfect evolutionary plan. You're looking at the descendants of the ones who made it through. Your ancestors survived cold periods. They survived hunger. They survived predators. They survived disease. They survived dangerous animals. They survived migrations into places they had never seen. And they kept going long enough for you to exist. That's an insane chain of survival. You are the end of a line that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. And somewhere along that line were people who had no idea that their survival would eventually lead to you. They weren't trying to create the modern world. They were just trying to make it through another winter. Find food. Protect their children. Stay alive. And somehow, they did. So when you look at human history, the biggest question isn't really, why did the other humans disappear? Maybe the bigger question is, how close were we to disappearing with them? Because Homo erectus lasted nearly 2 million years. Neanderthals survived hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans left genetic traces across entire regions. Homo floresiensis survived in an isolated world for thousands of years. All of them were human. All of them had their own story. And all of them eventually became history. Except us. For now. And that's the part worth remembering the next time you look at another person and think they're completely different from you. Different face. Different accent. Different country. Different life. Underneath all of that is something much older. We are all carrying the result of thousands of generations that refuse to disappear. You're not just here because your ancestors survived. You're here because an unbroken chain of ordinary people survived long enough for you to be born. And if that chain had broken just once, you wouldn't be here to wonder about it. Maybe that's the strangest thing about being human. We spend our lives worrying about what comes next, while the fact that we're here at all is the result of something that almost didn't happen.